Now we're at kind of a smaller group. I'm expecting that a couple more will trickle in though. But I do want to go ahead and get started. We'll get started somewhat slowly so that people have a minute or two to ease in. Uh, but we'll kind of dive into things here and see where today takes us. So first off, I am going to drop a link to the agenda in the chat, just like I typically do. Um, so you should be able to open up that right there. And then I'm also going to just provide a link to UEN's website. I've talked about UEN's website a couple of times now, but the main thing that I wanted to reiterate was simply under the professional development tab on UEN's website, you have access to a number of resources on Canvas, but also courses and things like that. As far as our agenda goes, though, that's what I want to start with. So I'm going to share my screen. And you can see that today we are on session 4. And there are a couple of things that I wanted to address to begin. The very first thing is obviously, my name is Braxton. Welcome back. This is session 4 out of 6 for us, I believe. And I already shared UEN's website. But the thing that I really wanted to touch on before we got too far into things today was simply reviewing what we've talked about so far. And the reason I want to do that is because I am taking a little bit of liberty in restructuring today's session so that we have more time to talk about some of the ideas that we began to touch on last time. And then we're going to come back to the ideas that were originally scheduled for today's session. So I want to kind of just review what we've talked about so we have a little bit of context for today's agenda. Now, in the first session, we started with just the basics of Canvas. How do you navigate Canvas? How do you adjust settings? So on and so forth. In that session, we also briefly talked about how to create or structure a homepage in your Canvas course. And then in session 2, we spent a lot of time talking about the rich content editor and how to build content within your Canvas course. And that's when we talked about adding images to a page, embedding items into a page, putting videos on a page, things like that. Then in our last session, we started talking about how to create assessment mechanisms and how to provide feedback inside of Canvas. And in particular, we looked at how to create assignments and then how to use Canvas Speed Grader. Also, in our last session, we very briefly started to touch on Canvas quizzes and how to build a quiz inside of Canvas. And I only took a couple of minutes to do that because I wanted to save the bulk of our conversation about quizzes for this afternoon. Now, with that said, as you can see for today's session, which is session 4, our original goal was to talk about how to make your Canvas course more visually engaging. But I think that we have time to still address quizzes and talk about some of those visual aspects because we spent a lot of time on session 2 talking about some of those features inside of the rich content editor that will make your course a little bit more visually engaging. Now, that said, today our agenda looks basically like finishing up our quizzes conversation. You can see that's the first few items. And then after we do that, the end of the session is going to be dedicated to returning back to this main idea of how do we make our course engaging for students. And we're mostly going to spend our time today talking about external tools and LTIs, because that was the one component of engagement and visual interaction that we weren't able to talk about in session 2. So that's the general scope of today's session. But before we dive into anything else, are there any questions that I can respond to first? All right, perfect. Well, just as we've done before, if you have any questions, please feel free to just put them in the chat today if you'd like. You're also welcome to interrupt me if that works best for you. You're welcome to come off of your microphone and just interject a question if you'd like. But at this point, we're going to start looking at quizzes. So I'm going to go into Canvas again. And I'm going to work in the same sample course that I've been working in before. So I'm just going to open up this sandbox course here. And as I'm opening up this course, you'll be able to see that we have some modules. And this top module is kind of the demo module that we've built throughout our sessions together. Um, You may remember that in modules, I have the ability to edit some of my module settings by going here, but I can also add things directly to my module by clicking on this plus button. Now, once I click on that, I can add assignments, quizzes, files, all of these things here. But today we're focused on quizzes, like I mentioned before. So I'm going to go ahead and add a quiz. And once I select quiz, it pulls up a list of the quizzes that are already created in my course. But today I want to build a new quiz so that I can highlight some of the features that exist inside of new quizzes in Canvas. So once I've clicked on that, I am prompted to create a quiz name. So I'm going to call this one new quizzes demo. And then I'm going to add that item. And then you can see that quiz pops up right here. And when I open that, I have the ability to set how many points it's worth. And today I'm going to say this is worth 10. I can change the assignment group. And you may remember we talked about assignment groups last time. Assignment groups essentially just allow you to weight different grades in your gradebook. And then, of course, I have my due date options that, again, we addressed last time. But the short version of that is I can set my due date, the available from date, which essentially is the date that students are able to access the quiz, and then my until date, which is when the quiz will lock. Once I'm ready to start building my quiz, though, I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom and I'm going to click on build. Now, I'm going to pause while this loads just to give you a quick caveat. Right now, I am working in what Canvas calls quote unquote new quizzes. New quizzes is Canvas's new version of their quiz building software. There's also a version of this inside of Canvas called classic quizzes. Now, the first time you create a quiz in Canvas, it's going to ask you whether you want to create a classic quiz or a new quiz. Today, I'm going to show you new quizzes because that's the platform that Canvas is moving towards. They're going to slowly start phasing out classic quizzes. However, just bear in mind that if my screen looks a little bit different than the screen you're used to, or if you had that pop-up appear on your screen when you created a quiz, that's the short explanation of why. So today we're in new quizzes, but just know that you also have a different platform that you could use inside of Canvas called Classic Quizzes. Now, last time we touched just briefly on some of these quiz elements, and I pointed out that you can adjust the title, you can add in any instructions that you want. Again, in the instructions, you get this rich content editor that we've talked about before, where you can add images, you can add text, you can add links to things, so on and so forth. So whatever you need to put in your quiz, you have the ability to. For right now, I'm just going to type instructions in here just so that we have something in that space for when we preview it. And then I'm going to go ahead and click on this plus button. Now, last time when we talked, all that I showed you was simply how to create a multiple choice question, which is right here. And we'll review that today. But additionally, there are all of these other types of questions. And I want to touch on a few of those other question types today to make sure that you're familiar with some of those options. After we talk about questions and we build a couple of those, then we'll look at some of the more advanced features inside of new quizzes that allow you to assess students really well, but also give them feedback and monitor their progress towards learning goals. So today I'm going to start with multiple choice because it's most straightforward. I'm going to move pretty quickly through this since we talked about it last time. But you can see at the top that I can title my question if I want to. So if I have a really big quiz, this is helpful because I can label the questions. So I might say, this is my first question about quadratic equations, maybe. And then after that, I can type in my question, whatever the question is. And then I have the option to write in all of my different answer options. And like I pointed out before, every time I add an answer option, again, I'm given the rich content editor. So I do have the ability to have students choose between images or text or links or so on and so forth. And I can add all of those in. Once I've added in as many answer options as I want, and I'm going to open that back up, you can see that down at the bottom, I have a couple of additional options. Students can have a calculator on their screen. I can shuffle the choices inside of this question. Excuse me. But additionally, I can also vary the points that students earn based on which answer they choose. I touched on that last time, but just to give you a quick demo, I could say that maybe for response A, people get 5 points. If they choose B, that's pretty good, but it's not exactly correct, so they only get three, and then they get zero for D and C. And so I could do something like that if I wanted to, or I can turn that off and just say this question is worth 1 point. You either get the point for answering correctly or you don't. Um, I'm going to hit done here though, because I want to show some of the other options that exist inside of new quizzes. Now, one of the really powerful ones that I've seen teachers use really well is categorization. Now, in categorization, again, I can title it if I want, I can put my question. Um, but more importantly, I can start creating categories for things, and then I can create answers inside of those categories. And students are going to be prompted to drag and drop the answers into the corresponding categories. So I might have something that looks like nouns and then verbs. And let's say I want another category. I'm going to click on plus category, and I'm going to say that this one is going to be adjectives. Then within those categories, I can obviously write out whatever answers I need. So I could say cat, dog, run, and angry. Let's do those. And I could set that up however I need for this question to work in my context. I'll hit done on that one though, so that I can highlight a couple others. Once I go to add another question, you can see that I have the ability to ask students to upload a file. I have the ability to ask them to generate some sort of formula or tell me a formula as their response. But I'm going to highlight the matching option right now. And you're probably familiar with how matching questions work, but the way this appears in Canvas is, again, I can put in my question, and then I'm just going to line up my question and answer side by side. So you could consider this item number one in your pair and item number two in your pair, so to speak, and you can build it out that way. So we'll say that apples go with oranges, and we'll say that tomatoes go with celery. And don't get too technical with me, because maybe tomatoes should go with apples. I don't know. I don't know. But that's our demo for here. You can see that students can also get partial credit for these. So what that means is if my question is worth, let's say, 10 points, let me go back there. If it's worth 10 points and my students get half of them correct, then they'll get 5 points for the question if I have that selected. If I select exact match, though, that means that students need to get all of the matches correct in order to get 10 points. So it's either 10 or nothing. I'm going to hit done on that one too. And then I'll just talk through a couple of these other options as well. Now, ordering allows you to create a sequence that students have to drag and drop ideas or concepts into. In other words, I've seen history teachers use this for timelines, and they could say, which of these events happened first? Please order them in chronological order, or something like that. And they might have like the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the Korean War, so on and so forth. You can also do this for steps in a procedure, and I've seen EMT teachers use this really well, where they say, in this situation, what are the steps that you need to follow? Make sure to order them in sequential order or something like that. Essay questions you're probably familiar with, fill in the blank you're probably familiar with. But one of the really powerful things that Canvas has added is a hotspot question. And for this one, I'm actually going to open this one up too, simply because I want to show you how this works inside of Canvas. So again, I can say whatever my question is. And then once I've typed in my question, then I'm going to choose an image. So this is going to pull up all of the images on my computer. And I'm going to just open up this. This is a picture of me and some of my colleagues at a conference. And you can see that this is loading. But once it has loaded, my next step is Canvas is going to ask me to select an area that I want as my answer. So let's say that my question, for some crazy reason, is just like select Braxton in this picture. What I can do is I can use any of these drawing tools here. So either a square, or an oval, or a polygon of some sort. Right now, I'll just say maybe a square. And then I'm going to select where the correct answer is. I'm right here, so I'm going to select that. And then what happens for students is they'll get prompted to say, click in the image where you see Braxton, or click in the image where you see Blink, whatever it is that you're assessing. And then Canvas will be able to auto grade this question by saying, did they click inside of this box? And if they did, they get credit. If they didn't, they don't get credit. And that has become a really powerful tool for a lot of teachers as well. In addition to that, you can see that we have multiple answer questions, which are just multiple choice questions, except students are selecting multiple. And then you can ask students to put in a numeric response or a true or false. And you're probably familiar with all of those. Now, that's a really quick rundown of some of the question types that exist within new quizzes. And I want to show you some additional features inside of new quizzes that can be really powerful. But before I do, I want to pause and just create a space for questions. Are there any questions I can respond to here? All right, cool. Let's keep moving on then. Um, I want to show you two more things in new quizzes. Excuse me, three. I'm going to add one to the list. So three more things in new quizzes. And those three items are feedback, which I touched on last time. So I'll just touch on that briefly here. Item banks, and then also your settings and moderation features. So we're going to start with feedback. And if you were here last time, you may remember that within any question in new quizzes, what I can do is I can add what's called feedback to that question. I can either add feedback to individual responses, or I can add feedback to the whole question. What that means is that as students select a response after they have submitted it, they're going to get a little pop-up in Canvas that gives them some feedback on their submission. So if they selected A, maybe it pops up and says, great job. But if they selected B, I might say something like, this is a good idea, but and I might explain a little bit more, something like that. I also have the ability though to give feedback to the entire question. So you can see here, if a student answers correctly, they're going to get this feedback. If they answer incorrectly, they're going to get this feedback. Or if I just want to give feedback to everyone, regardless of the answer, I can put that here. And that exists as an option in all of my question types inside of Canvas. So like we talked about last time, feedback can be a really powerful driver for learning. And I've seen feedback used really well inside of quizzes so that students aren't only going through the quiz to be assessed, which is important in and of itself, but they're also going through the quiz to get feedback so that they can be pushed back into the learning process. And I've seen that work really well too. Um, Now, with that said, like I mentioned before, I want to show you item banks and I want to show you some of your setting and moderation features in new quizzes. I'm going to start with settings and then we'll get into item banks afterwards. So you can see at the top here, I have some options. One of those options is settings. One is reports, one is moderate, and one is exports. We're not really going to talk too much about reports and exports today, but the short version of those is reports is where you'll find all of your quiz data. So which questions were answered correctly most frequently, so on and so forth. Exports allows you to export your quiz if you want to. But today we're going to focus on settings and moderate, and we'll start with settings. Now, inside of settings, you can see there are a number of settings that I can adjust that control the entire quiz. So I can shuffle the order of my questions. I can shuffle the answers for all of my questions. I can prompt Canvas to only show one question at a time. And then you can see I have this other option to allow backtracking. If I turn that off, that means students get one question at a time, and then they can't move backwards in the quiz. So once they answer, there's no going back to that question. Again, I can toggle that on or off if I want to. I can require students to have some sort of code, and this will prompt students to enter a code before they're able to complete the quiz. And I can set that to whatever I need to be. I can also set an automatic time limit on the quiz, and so Canvas will automatically shut students' quizzes once the time limit is hit. Um, Filtering IP addresses gets a little bit more complex, but you can see that I also can allow a calculator. I can allow students to clear their selections. And then I can show custom feedback with results. And so you can see, again, this is another option that I have to provide students some feedback as they are looking at their quiz results. And what this means in particular is this feedback will appear for the quiz as a whole, whereas the feedback that I showed you before will essentially be aligned to specific questions. Below that, you see that I can allow multiple attempts on my quiz. And then I also could set how students are scored based on those multiple attempts. So I can have Canvas keep their highest score, their average score, their latest score, or their first score. Um, then I can type in how many attempts I want. And the really cool features that Canvas has built in new quizzes that I think are really helpful for teachers are first off, waiting periods. And so let's say that I have a quiz and I'm okay with students taking it as many times as they want to take it. I can toggle this on and say they're still allowed to take it as many times as they want, but they need to wait 2 hours between each attempt. Oops, I turned that off. And by doing that, it's going to incentivize, hopefully, it's going to incentivize students to go back and study a little bit more before they take the quiz again. Because one thing that a lot of teachers noticed is that students would take the quiz, not get the score they want, and immediately take it again without actually really studying or learning anything. So that's a really cool new feature. And again, you can see that you can set that to whatever you need it to be. And then you also have this build on last attempt feature. And what that means is, let's say that I'm a student and this quiz has unlimited attempts. I can take it as many times as I need. And let's say for our example that the quiz has 10 questions inside of it. And on my first attempt, I got 8 of those 10 questions correct. If my teacher has enabled build on last attempt, when I go to take that quiz again, I'm only going to see the questions that I missed. And then those answers are going to be added to my overall score. So let's say that I got 8 out of 10 on my first attempt. Then I go back in. I only see 2 questions now because I only missed 2 questions. Let's say on my second attempt, I get one of them correct. Now my new score is going to be 9 out of 10. Again, that can be really helpful as teachers are trying to target specific skills or knowledge areas that students need to build on. And then finally, you can restrict what students do and do not see at the end of the quiz. And so you can see that I can allow them to see the amount of points they got, the amount of points possible, so on and so forth. And by checking these, they'll be allowed to see it. And I can control what they're allowed to see as much as I'd like to. Now, can I respond to any questions about our quiz settings before I get into your moderation features? All right, perfect. So I'll go to moderate. And essentially, what moderate allows you to do is it allows you to set controls for individual students and have students experience the quiz a bit differently based on their needs and accommodations. Now, because this is just a sample course, I just have 3 students in here. They're just like sample demo students. Um, but you could see if that student had attempted a quiz multiple times, it would tell me how many, it would tell me what their score was, how long it had taken them. And then I could also pull up a log of all their attempts and how long it had taken to answer each question, so on and so forth. The really powerful thing, though, comes in right over here with accommodations. And so we're going to edit Val's accommodations right now. And if I hit this pencil, you'll see that I have some abilities to change the way quizzes interact with Val or how Val interacts with quizzes. Now, I get this pop-up that's really important. As I change Val's accommodations, accommodations will apply to every quiz that Val takes inside of my course. Now, that is designed to help save teachers some time, but it's something to be mindful of as you're adjusting it. Now, the use case for this is in my classroom, I had a variety of students with IEPs, and some of those IEPs said that students get time and a half on any assessment in class. That meant that if I had time limits on any of my tests or quizzes, I need to give that student time and a half. And so I need to adjust the time limit for that student. That wasn't really possible in classic quizzes. But now what we can do in new quizzes is you can see time adjustments. I have this option to say, for every single quiz that Val takes, she gets an extra hour or she gets an extra 30 minutes. Or I can say, for any quiz that Val takes in my class, there's never going to be a time limit, even if I've set a time limit for that quiz. And then finally, I can also put in a multiplier. which is again that time and a half that I mentioned before. So for every quiz that Val takes, she gets time and a half, and Canvas will automatically calculate that for me and automatically adapt it for me. Now, again, this would apply to all of Val's quizzes inside of my course. However, I also have the ability to moderate this specific quiz. And what I can do there is once I click on moderate, you can see that I can allow Val additional attempts. So maybe let's say that this quiz only had 2 attempts, but I want Val to have 5 attempts for some reason. I can go in and say, you know what, Val gets 3 additional attempts. And then additionally, I can set time adjustments for this quiz in particular if I wanted to. So again, the difference between these accommodations apply to all of your quizzes. Moderate applies to this particular quiz. Hopefully that gave you a really quick rundown of some of the ways that you might be able to sort of differentiate or accommodate for your learners. But I'll pause once more here. Are there any questions that I can respond to? All right, perfect. Last thing I want to show you in quizzes is called item banks. So I'm going to go back to build and I'm going to just point out a couple of things inside of this quiz, but then we're actually going to go back into Canvas so that I can show you this in a different way. Now, first, I want to describe what we're looking at. What an item bank is in Canvas, I can create a list of potential questions that students might receive. So let's say that in my context, I'm teaching language arts or English, and I have 20 questions on commas. But I don't necessarily want students to go through all 20 questions. I want some questions to go to these students and some questions to go to these students. And I want it mixed up so that all of my students are getting different questions. That would be an item bank. And that's what item banks do. So inside of an item bank, I can create a variety of questions. And then inside of my quiz, Canvas will automatically pull questions at random from that bank. So here's what that might look like. First off, I can look at all my item banks by clicking on my item banks option right here. But additionally, if I go to this plus button again, you can see that I also have my item banks logo right here. And that's going to pull up all the banks that exist inside of this course. Now, in this course, I only have one item bank, just this sample one. But what I could do is I can click on that, and it says there are no questions in the bank. So we'll fix that in just a minute. I'm going to show you how to add a question. But once I've selected that, then Canvas will prompt me to say how many questions do you want to pull from this item bank, and how many points do you want each question to be worth. And this became really helpful for me as a teacher because now what I could do is let's say that I'm creating some big grammar assessment. Typically wouldn't do that, but let's say that I was in this situation. And on this grammar assessment, I have comma questions, semicolon questions, all sorts of different types of questions. I can create separate item banks for each type of question that I want. And then I could just select the item bank by going to that plus sign and choosing it. And then Canvas will randomly pull in 2 or 3 or 4 or however many questions I specify into that assessment for students to see. Now, that has 2 benefits. The first benefit is that if you are having students complete quizzes on their own time, or maybe you're not proctoring the quizzes in any way, this obviously can be used to reduce cheating because now students are receiving different questions from each other. So it's impossible for Tony to go over to his friend Jimmy and just compare answers back and forth because they're receiving different questions. The other benefit, and the benefit that was more interesting to me as a teacher, is that each time a student takes the quiz, they're going to get new questions. And again, it's pulling at random. So statistically speaking, every now and then, students are probably going to see repeat questions, but that randomization resets with every attempt. And so for me, it was really important to me that my students had multiple attempts to complete a quiz, but I also didn't want them to just get the same questions over and over and memorize all of the answers to those questions. And so I would create item banks so that students could have unlimited attempts in a quiz, but we're still receiving new questions with each attempt. So that's kind of the use case and how that could be valuable. With that said, though, I do want to go back to Canvas in general. So back to our Canvas course, so that you can see how I manage those item banks. Now, in my course navigation on the left-hand side, you'll see that I have an option for item banks right here. Once I click on that, it's going to bring up my list of item banks. And as we saw before, I only have one right here. But when I click on that item bank, I can add a new question to it. And I have all of those question options that you saw before. I'm just going to go ahead and do an essay question. And my prompt is just going to be question. You can see that I have some options. Do I want students to have a calculator? Do I want them to have spell check, word limit, word count, so on and so forth? Um, but I'll just leave it at that and hit done. Now inside of my question bank, you could see, or my item bank, excuse me, you could see that I have this question and I could keep adding to that as needed. Once I have as many questions as I need or as I want, I can go back to my full item banks list and I should be able to see how many questions are in that item bank. And then I could see when the item bank was last used in a quiz and when it was created. Additionally, I can copy that item bank. I can continue to edit that item bank. I can delete the item bank, but really important for us is we can share the item bank as well. So when I click on share, you see that I have the ability to now enter in colleagues' names and I can set the level of access that they receive. So maybe they can only view an item bank. That means they are good to look at it, they're good to use it in their quizzes, but they can't contribute their own questions and they can't change my questions. And I can just put in their name or their email address, hit add, and suddenly they have access. Additionally, though, I can set them up as editors if I wanted to as well. And what this will do is this obviously gives them the ability to edit the item bank so they can add their own questions. They can change the questions that are in there. But the important thing to know about editing access is let's say that Val and I, Val is one of my colleagues, let's say that Val and I are both editors on an item bank. And I have built a quiz that uses our commas item bank. And I am going to give that quiz on Friday. Let's say that Val goes in and edits the questions on Thursday. Even though I've already made my quiz, maybe I made my quiz earlier in the week, and I already told Canvas to randomly select some questions from the commas item bank. When Val makes that edit will be alive as soon as she makes it. So if my students are completing that quiz on Friday, they will see quiz questions that have been edited by Val. Similarly, I'm tripping over my words today. Similarly, along the same lines, if students maybe completed that quiz on Friday, but I noticed that there was an issue with a couple of questions on Monday, and I edited the questions in the item bank, they would then get the updated version of those questions if they retook the test on Tuesday or something like that. Um, so that becomes really helpful if you're collaborating with colleagues and you want to share the workload a little bit. You can both contribute to an item bank, and then you can just add the item bank to your quizzes. You also have the ability to send the item bank to different courses if you want. And for your entire Canvas instance, you can make the item bank available for anyone who is using the same instance as you. So if there's someone in the district who wants your item bank and you've made it publicly available, they could just grab it without necessarily asking you first. With that said, if you turn this on, they're only going to get view only permission in that context. Additionally, you need to remember that typically every district has their own Canvas instance, and this will only apply to your instance. Along the same lines, you can't very easily share item banks across Canvas instances. So if you have a friend who works in Granite School District, and let's say that you work in Washington School District, it's going to be, you can't just directly share the item bank through this means because they're using a different instance of Canvas. Now, with that said, I feel like I kind of babbled on some fairly abstract ideas there. So I want to give one more chance for questions before we shift gears away from quizzes and talk a little bit more about LTIs. But before we get to LTIs, what can I address before we move on? What questions can I answer? All right, perfect. Well, we will keep just pressing on today then. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop back to our agenda just to kind of reframe our session a little bit. Like I mentioned before, last time we talked about assessment and feedback, and that obviously spilled over into today as we wrapped up our conversation about quizzes. That got us all the way down to this point here, which is where we are going to jump back in to making your content in Canvas a little bit more visual and a little bit more engaging. And we're going to do that in, well, I'll say this. We're going to approach that through the framework of design thinking and perhaps universal design for learning. We'll kind of touch on those to begin with. What I want to mostly focus on, though, like I mentioned before, was LTIs. And the easiest way to do that is to go back to the modules in this course that we've been looking at today. So you can see that I have my big list of modules here, and I'm just going to get rid of that quiz that we were working on. And this is essentially what my Canvas course looks like for students. Now, with that said, you'll probably notice that right now I have my homepage set to modules. Excuse me. Now, if you remember back to session 2, we talked about how you could create your own visual homepage that maybe looked a little bit more interesting than just a list of assignments that students needed to complete. And we spent some time during session 2 creating those pages, or starting to create those pages at least, and talking about what may or may not go on your page. Now, just to give you a little bit more context, you can see that in one of the courses that I'm teaching right now, this is what my homepage might look like. So again, this looks a lot different than what we were looking at before. It has an image, it has some buttons, it has some text explaining what the course is all about, so on and so forth. Inside of my course that we're looking at, I simply have a list of modules. Now, with that said, the way to turn on my pages would, or excuse me, the way to turn on my homepage would be to make sure that I had set a homepage under my pages tab, but then I could go here and click on choose homepage and select that homepage from my list. Today, I'm going to keep working in my modules, so I'm not going to set a homepage quite yet because I want to show you how you might incorporate LTIs into your class and how that might be helpful for you in your content areas. So the very first thing is I want to define what an LTI is because you may or may not be familiar with what an LTI does. Now, an LTI is simply some sort of tool that connects one tool to another tool. In this example, I'm going to show you how I can integrate Nearpod directly into Canvas without making my students need to ever exit my Canvas course. So in other words, they'll be able to access my Nearpod lessons inside of my course without ever needing to leave. Now, I'm going to show you how to set that up in a couple of different ways in just a moment. But the thing that I want to mention first, and this is where our conversation about home pages comes into play, is depending on the tool that you're using, you might be able to use an LTI to embed content directly on a page. And not only embed that content, but make that content interactive as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in a moment. But for right now, I want you to think of LTIs through this lens of pulling content from another place into your Canvas course. And the reason why that's so important is because there's a lot of research that shows that the better organized a course is and the more easily accessible the course content is, the better students do in general. Additionally, we know from a lot of design research that people like to engage more with things that are visual and visually appealing. And so this conversation around LTIs kind of plays into those ideas of how do we make students' online learning experience as seamless as possible, and how do we make it as visually engaging as possible. So that's where we're headed. Now, all of that said, we're going to step through the process of using an LTI. And again, like I mentioned before, there are a couple of ways to do this. So I'm going to show this process in probably 3 different scenarios. The first one, though, is just to go back up to my plus button in my module. And once I click on that plus button, again, we've talked about this a couple of times now. I have this drop down where I can choose to add different things to this module. And we've talked about assignments, quizzes, files, pages, discussions, all of these. The one element that we haven't touched on quite yet is external tool here. Um, Candice, I see your question. The short version of my short answer is no. However, I think that there are some ways to work around that. And I'll touch on those in just a second, but that's a really good question. So thank you for bringing that up. So where I went before is I just went to my plus button in the module, and then in my drop-down menu, I selected external tool. And then you can see that I have this big list of external tools that I can choose from. Now, this list of external tools depends on the Canvas instance that you are using. So in other words, if you are on the USB-E Canvas instance, you're going to have a list of external tools that has been added by your Canvas administrator at USB-E. If you are using a district's instance of Canvas, again, you might get a different list because maybe that Canvas administrator has added in different tools. So that's just something to be mindful of. That said, it's not extremely difficult to add tools. So if you have a tool that you're looking for that isn't on the list, usually you can reach out to your Canvas administrator and they should be able to add that. Now, that said, from my list of tools here, I am going to go to Flip, so we'll return back to this point that you made earlier, Candice. But I'm going to select Nearpod, and I said Flip before, but I meant Nearpod. I'm going to select Nearpod from my list, and once I do, you'll see that this window pulls up, and inside of this window, you'll see all of my Nearpod lessons that I have inside of my account. So basically, I'm just peeking into my Nearpod account right now. This lesson right at the top is just a sample one that I created earlier today in preparation for our session. And so I'm going to use that one. Now, when I hover over it, you can see that I'm prompted to teach that. Again, this is Nearpod's interface, not necessarily Canvas's. And I'm going to create a student pace lesson for this, so I'll select that. And then you can see that I return back to this window here. Now, once I'm back at this window, my next step is to add the item. And if you're not sure if it populated or not, you can scroll down a little bit. And once I've scrolled down, you can see that I have a URL here, and that URL should be taking me to somewhere in Nearpod, so that looks good. And then I can also choose what I want this item to be named inside of Canvas. And so I'm going to just call this Nearpod Demo 1. And I'm going to go ahead and hit add item. And now you can see that that's appeared in my module. Now you'll remember that I need to publish this before students can access it. But once I've published it, I should be able to look at my module as a student. And I can open that up. And now you'll see that that Nearpod lesson just appears right inside of Canvas, and I don't need to leave Canvas to access that. I can sign into Nearpod, and then I can just go through and scroll through that lesson as needed. So that's one way to add any sort of external tool to your Canvas course. The way I've done it here is just as a page. So this is just a resource for people to access and look at. It's not necessarily an assignment. Now, with that said, Candice, I do want to return back to your question here. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm actually going to open up Nearpod so that you can see what's happening on the back end of Nearpod as well. I'm going to log in. And you'll remember that I just selected this lesson right here. So if I go into Teach and I go into Student Paste, you can see that it's actually presenting me with a new student paste code right here. So when I go to view progress, you'll see that no one has entered this one yet because this is a separate instance of this lesson from the instance that we just added to Canvas. So the reason I show you all of that is because we're kind of like in a yes and no state with Nearpod right now in response to your question. What I mean by that is any Nearpod lessons that you have added prior to, I'm a little bit hazy on the exact date, but I'd say probably prior to June. So we're talking last school year. All of those lessons are probably expired. However, Nearpod has updated their LTI so that as you are adding in elements to Canvas through the LTI, if you work in the same way that I just did, Those self-paced lessons should now remain open. And I say should because I haven't tested it yet because it's a fairly recent update. So fingers crossed. But new ones that you add should remain open. Old ones that have been added, you'll probably need to replace at this point and just add them again. Um, Additionally, though, I would also say that my understanding of the new LTI or the update to the LTI is that the time frame that you put in for assignments, which we're going to look at next, may dictate how long that Nearpod lesson remains open. And what I mean by that is, let's say that I create a Nearpod assignment, and again, we'll look at an example. The due dates that I enter may impact when that Nearpod lesson closes, so to speak. Again, I haven't tested that. It's a fairly recent update. That's just my understanding of it. So I could be wrong. Hopefully it just remains open. But that's what I've heard. So again, that was kind of like a yes and no answer for you. Hopefully that provided you with at least a little bit of context, though. Now, as I was explaining that, and as I was kind of trying to work through the nuances of the Nearpod LTI, I referred to the fact that you can build external tool assignments in Canvas, and I also want to step through that process as well. So I'm going to go back to my homepage so that you can see my module again. Again, this is the external tool that we just added, and essentially that just plopped a Nearpod lesson on a page. But additionally, if I go back up to my plus button, I can also create an external tool assignment. And that's what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to create a new assignment and I'm going to call this Nearpod Demo 2. And now once I add that, you'll see based on the little icon right here that I've added a different type of feature. Instead of just a link to an external tool that's embedded on a page, now I have an assignment that I'm working with. This icon right here indicates that I'm working with an assignment. Now, once I open that up, I'll have the same assignment editing options that I do in any assignment. So again, I can title it. I have my rich content editor. I can write whatever instructions I need to. I can put in pictures, so on and so forth. Adjust the points, adjust the assignment group, assign a due date. All of those elements still remain. The important one for us today, though, is under the submission type. And you may remember that last week we talked about different submission types. If I click on this dropdown, we talked a lot about online submissions. We talked about on-paper submissions. We also briefly touched on lucid submissions, but we kind of glazed over external tool submissions. And that's because I wanted to save that conversation for today. So once I click on external tool, I'm going to get this little link space right here and a button that says find. And once I click on find, you'll see a small window that looks really similar to what we were looking at before. It's just a little bit smaller now. And I'm going to go back down into Nearpod. And I'm going to select that same lesson as before, say teach. I'll say it's student paste. Then I'll hit select. And now you can see that that link populates into this field right here. I also have the ability to load the tool in a new tab. And what that means is that once students click Start Assignment, a new tab will open up in their browser that will just be Nearpod. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But in my mind, that kind of defeats the point of using an external tool. Part of the power of an external tool is that we can embed it directly inside of Canvas so that students don't need to leave Canvas. So generally, I leave that unchecked. But then again, I can put in my due date, so on and so forth, and adjust the settings however I need to. And I'll just say the due date is going to be October 10th. I'm going to save and publish this, though. And once I do, you'll be able to see what it looks like for students. So at the very top, you can see that I have my assignment title. And you'll probably also notice that my assignment title has changed now. Canvas automatically updated that based on the Nearpod lesson that I selected. My lesson is just an untitled lesson, and it says Nearpod student paste. I can always go back to my assignment settings and overwrite that if I want to. So if I say, no, I don't want it called that, I want it called Nearpod Demo 2. I can do that if I want. But Canvas is intelligent enough to kind of predict what it thinks your title should be or what you might want your title to be. And so it will populate that in. You'll also be able to see right below that I started to type in some instructions. So whatever instructions you put will still appear there. And then right below that, Nearpod should appear. And it looks like it's struggling to load right now, so I'm going to refresh the page. Here we go. And Nearpod's going to pull up in this box. And again, it looks exactly like it looked before. But the difference here is if I go back to home, I'm going to put Canvas into student mode. And I'm going to go in and complete this assignment as a student now. So I'm going to open this up. And then once I've opened it up, I need to sign in. Sign in as Braxton. Yes, continue. And I could go through this lesson and complete all the activities in this lesson and do whatever I need to. And here's my little collaborate board, and I'm just going to say test, something like that. And then I'll send that. And let's say that I'm not a great student and I don't submit the lesson. And I just go back to the homepage. Now, what you'll be able to see on the teacher side is, as you can see, I have a new item in my to-do list here that's prompting me to now grade that Nearpod assignment. And this is the thing that I mostly wanted to show and demonstrate, because this is where external tools can become powerful as well. In that assignment, you noticed me interacting with Nearpod, but Nearpod's going to automatically take all of the data that I generated while completing that assignment and send it over to Canvas. So now if I open up my to-do list and click on grade that assignment, you'll see that my test student participated in 0% of the activities and 0% of the quizzes. Um, that's because I didn't submit anything, right? But I'm getting this overall picture of how that student did. And then just within Canvas, I can enter a grade. So again, I don't need to go to Nearpod and look at how students did inside of Nearpod. Again, this can all just happen in Canvas. That helps you as the teacher, but it also really helps students because, like I mentioned before, now they don't have to manage 8 different tools that you want to use for your class. They only need to know that everything is in Canvas. And if they go to Canvas and they go to their modules, they'll be able to access Nearpod inside of their module and complete the assignment through Nearpod inside of their module without ever having to leave. And that might not sound like a super big thing, but if you are a student who is taking multiple classes, let's say you have 4 classes, and each of your teachers uses 3 different tools. Again, 3 tools isn't really that many, but we are already up to potentially 12 different tools. And that can be really overwhelming for students if they're bombarded with a lot of diverse sets of technology that they need to work with in order to complete their assignments. So external tools are a really good way to just build that content directly into your Canvas course so that students don't need to hop all over the internet. Additionally, though, to tie it back to this idea of making things visually engaging, if I go back to this page here, so Nearpod Demo 1, you'll see that my entire Nearpod lesson now takes up the window of my Canvas screen. And so as I interact with this lesson, it's now as if I am in the Nearpod content itself. And this can be a really powerful way for students to access your course content because now they're getting it presented to them in a visual way that's a little bit more interactive. Again, they can kind of sort through these, they can open up the list of what they're going to see and jump ahead if they need to. They can write notes directly in that window, so on and so forth. So external tools are a really good way to make your courses feel more engaging and be more engaging for students. Now, at this point, we have roughly 5 minutes left. And I want to take a minute to respond to any questions. And then I just want to kind of wrap things up and reorient us for the last couple of sessions that we'll have in the upcoming weeks. But first, questions from you. So, what questions can I respond to before we start wrapping things up? All right. Perfect. Well, if you think of questions, put them in the chat because we have a couple more minutes. But the last thing I want to do is this. I just want to return back to our agenda. Again, today we kind of messed with our sessions a little bit, but that should put us right back on track for our last two sessions that you see right here. So next week, we are going to begin talking about how to personalize learning in Canvas. And this is one of the sessions that I'm really excited about because this for me is where Canvas can become really powerful. Canvas has a number of built-in tools that allow you to differentiate really quickly and really meaningfully for students. And I think that those tools can facilitate really deep learning for your students. So we'll start talking about that next week. Primarily, we're going to talk about groups and how to create student groups. We're going to touch on item banks again, but I'm really not going to go into too much depth because we primarily talked about that today. But we'll talk about how item banks can facilitate differentiated learning. And then we'll talk about how to give accommodations a little bit more and how to provide due dates or flexible due dates. These ideas are ideas that we've somewhat touched on throughout the course, but I want to bring them together next week. And we'll bring them together in combination with some of these ideas. After that, we're going to talk about mastery paths and how to use different gradebook settings and filters to target specific student needs. Mastery paths is one of my favorite features in Canvas, so I'm excited that we'll be able to end on that note. So hopefully that gives you a quick preview of what we'll be talking about in the next few weeks. But at this point, we're going to go ahead and end about 2 minutes early, which is a first for us because I am a talker. So thank you for bearing with me as I've talked through everything. But if you have any last questions, feel free to stay on the call. I'm happy to respond to those as needed. But again, thanks for being here, and I'll see you again next week.